Socrates says in the Phaedo that the unexamined life is not worth living. And that's one of the most pregnant and interesting phrases in the Socratic dialogues. And it's worth looking at a couple of dialogues for Plato's representation of what the examined life is and what the examined life offers us and how we might go about examining human life. And I'd like to look today, or in this lecture, at the dialogues called the Theaetetus and the Timaeus as examples of the examined life, human beings examining the external world, describing the natural world around them, its causes and its meaning, because Plato thinks that the external world means something, it exists purposively, and it contains telos, which is the Greek word for purpose. Plato also, in the other dialogue, the Theaetetus, examines the nature of knowledge with a good interlocutor. In other words, the things that go wrong in the Meno, or in the Euthydemus, come from the fact that the interlocutor is inferior and vicious, unable to conduct a Platonic dialogue. In the case of the Theaetetus, we get an excellent interlocutor, someone that knows how to talk, or even if if Theaetetus is not sure of what he wants to say, he's at least willing to exert himself and to use his head and to accept the discipline involved in the dialectical process, the process of asking and answering questions. So looking at these two dialogues will give us an idea, or at least a glimpse, of what the examined life points to and what the examined life could be. In particular, Plato never wrote a dialogue called On Nature or On the Cosmos. So the closest we're going to get for Plato's views of cosmology, of the whole logos of the cosmos, of the meaning of everything, and human life and its place in nature, we're going to find in the Timaeus, which is a late dialogue, which is heavily veiled in a sort of mythic form. It has a lot of what I would describe as Pythagorean mathematical magic and number magic in particular inside it. Also, it's a largely mythological dialogue. Plato is not a great friend or great fan of the external world. He is not impressed with the knowability or even the reality of the world of the senses. Plato wants us to direct our attention towards the realm of mind, the realm of pure thought, the realm of the ideas. This will make more sense and will become clear to you when I finish my lectures on the Republic. But for now, when we look into Plato's treatment of the external world, always bear in mind the fact that he's not impressed with tables and chairs. He's impressed with pure ideas. Remember that mathematics is the key discipline for Plato, particularly Plato's thinking about knowledge. So whenever he talks about the external world, it's with some reluctance because he's not impressed with the activity of describing the external world. He doesn't think highly of the physicists, and he doesn't think highly of physics in the Greek sense, nature. And he looks down upon nature compared with the realm of ideas. In Theaetetus, we'll look at the contemplative life. We'll look inward rather than outward. We'll look at the soul, and we'll look at knowledge, and we'll look at the knower. And in particular, we'll look at the big existential question, which is facing death. The Timaeus begins with a discussion of the fact that Timaeus, who had been such a promising young man when Socrates met him, has been wounded and is now ill and is on the point of death. And at the end of the Timaeus, we'll find that Socrates is about to go and answer charges preferred by Anytus and Meletus and the other accusers who are eventually going to kill him. So the Theaetetus, even though it is a very interesting dialogue with an excellent interlocutor, this promising young man Theaetetus, is written in what I would call a minor key. It's a kind of sad dialogue because there's the implication of human mortality. There's the reference to the finality of human life, its evanescence, and its queer status, the queer status of souls in the natural physical world. Because Socrates thinks of human beings as being a soul occupying a body, and the souls go round and round in a cycle of birth and reincarnation, whereas bodies come and go. That helps suggest to us why he doesn't think much of the physical world. Thinks much more important is the world of the soul, the world of the mind. So in the Theaetetus, we're going to see a discussion of the question of knowledge, a discussion of the examined life, and there's something in the middle of it called the digression. And I want to advance a kind of unusual interpretation of this digression. I want to say that what's called a digression is in fact the marrow. It's truly the center. This term digression for this encomium on the examined life, or on the philosophical contemplative life, is in fact not a digression at all. It's the center of the dialogue. And encomium, since I'll be using this term throughout my lectures, is a speech of praise. It's a particular kind of speech in which you praise a person or a thing. So when we give an encomium on the examined life or on the philosophical life, we're speaking in praise of that as opposed to the active life, the world of praxis. Let's start out with the Timaeus. Timaeus is a late dialogue, and this is Plato's contribution to the theory of nature. Now, the Greek theory of nature is a turning of the corner, or at least the Ionian physics that is generated about 100 years before Socrates, is a turning of the corner in our knowledge of the physical world, because it's the beginning of those naturalistic, materialistic, mechanistic conceptions of the universe which leave out divine providence, which leave out meaningless, which leave out meaning, which create just a blind, pointless intermixing of atoms or intermixing of elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And Plato is trying in the Timaeus, it's a late dialogue, to give an alternative account of the physical universe. Now, because the Timaeus is alleged to have happened on the day after the Republic, and the Republic, of course, is one of the great dialogues Plato ever created, we can presuppose here the theory of knowledge that we find in the Republic. And I'll give you the details of that when I cover that dialogue. But just for our purposes, it's important to note that in the Republic, our knowledge of the physical world is less certain and less secure and less true, less real than our knowledge of mathematical things. And for that reason, the best you're going to get when you account for the physical world at Plato's time and in Plato's perspective is what he would call true opinion. In other words, he can give you a story which will give you roughly correct opinions about the physical universe, where it comes from, how it was constructed, and why it works the way it does. But you're never going to get real knowledge of that. You can't have real knowledge about the physical universe. You can just have real knowledge about pure ideas. I'll justify that argument later on when I cover the Republic. But for now, just keep that in mind. So when we find Plato's account of the physical universe implausible, or kind of silly, or perhaps rather quaint compared to our current conception of the physical reality, always remember that he's working on a different set of assumptions. He has not been around for the rise of modern natural science. He has not seen the conquest of nature, which flows from the technological developments that come from the new science of the 17th and 18th centuries. So when we look back from Plato's perspective, the physical naturalistic achievements of Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, and also later of Democritus and Empedocles, don't amount to all that much. Socrates was always more interested in inquiring into himself and into the soul, into the nature of human things. External nature didn't interest him very much. It didn't interest Plato very much either, but he felt like he ought to have some such addition to his conception of the universe. So he had, in his late dialogues, he adds this in a kind of reluctant way so that he has a theory of nature. Now, you may want to think about Plato's theory of nature as being not a theory of nature in the sense that we might get a physics textbook and you might derive some equations from that and be able to generate all physical processes. Plato's views on nature, as they're expressed in the Timaeus, are rather like a hymn to nature. You don't quite sing the Timaeus, but it's clearly a sort of poetic enterprise, and there's a heavy mythological emphasis. He doesn't try and get towards a mechanistic materialism, which he thinks is dangerous for the human soul and dangerous for political and moral order. So Plato is going to give an account of nature which is teleological and which is a theodicy. When I say that it's a theodicy, I mean that he's justifying God's ways to man. In other words, he's not just explaining to you why things are the way they are and why the physical world is constructed in the way that it is, but rather why God would want it that way and why it's best for God to have arranged it that way, that being the nature of divine providence. So all of his natural theory, or his theory of nature, genuflects to some divine idea, and it only serves the function of legitimizing and making plausible this divine idea. Plato doesn't think much of physics except as it may help people improve their souls. And the only way you can do that is by removing the mechanistic, arbitrary element from Greek physics and adding this new idea of teleology. Telos in Greek is the word for purpose. And Plato is trying to convince his listeners that everything happens for a purpose. Everything happens for a reason. The divine demiurge, the creator God, created the world for a reason, and everything is there for a particular reason, doing what it's doing for a particular reason. It all ultimately serves the best because God has only good intentions and good wishes. Those of you who know Candide by Voltaire, an elaborate lampoon of this idea is presented there. Leibniz, who is also an idealist philosopher many centuries later, has much the same idea that Plato does, that everything in the natural world happens for a reason because there's a good and beneficent providence behind it, and that means that everything has a reason behind it. Well, Plato holds that view. We may not hold it now, but at the time what he was trying to do is reconcile nomos and physis, reconcile political or moral law and natural law, undo the distinction, to show that our ideas of right and wrong are really natural if nature is properly understood. So all of Plato's natural theory exists only to legitimize the life of the soul and the organization of morality within a political life, within the state. So he's trying to create a physics that isn't dangerous to moral and political life. Now, what does he tell us in his physics? Well, first of all, God created the universe. The universe didn't just happen. It isn't a chaos. In fact, there's a demiurge, a creator God, that decided, due to his own goodness and his own beneficence, to organize the chaotic matter of the world into a cosmos, into an ordered unity that means something. And Plato thinks that he can discern, if not these meanings, he can give you at least plausible opinion or true opinion about the realities of God's plan for the universe. Now, Plato, once he gets this creator God putting things together, he finds that the cataclysms happen every once in a while which wipe out states, and later on he had hoped to write something called the Critias, in which he would talk about the early history of Athens when it was very much like the society of Plato's Republic. It was quite perfect, and things were much better then. In Plato you'll find often a sort of yearning for a lost innocence. He reminds me of Hesiod, the Greek poet, because he seems to long for a golden time many centuries ago before things became depraved the way they are now. And one gets the sense that in talking about the origins of Athens, which in a dialogue he never completed, the Critias, which is supposed to come after the Timaeus, that he really isn't satisfied with human life and knows that God would have created nature in some good way. It's just that it's very hard for him to bridge the gap, to know how to account for the depravity of the world as it is now. So I think that's one of the reasons why the Critias never gets written. Stepping in to take the place of Critias before we discuss the early history of Athens, we're going to have Timaeus. Timaeus is the main speaker in the dialogue called the Timaeus, and he's an astronomer. Of all the natural sciences, Plato's favorite is astronomy. It's the one that's the most celestial. It's the one that's furthest removed from the mundane, prosaic realities of everyday life. And it seems to gesture at something outside of the physical universe. In the Phaedrus, he talks about the good soul that sees the forms as moving to the back of the universe, moving to the top of the universe, being able to step outside of space and time altogether. It's a beautiful poetic image. The difficulty is that it's a little bit difficult for us to bring that beautiful poetic imagery to our understanding of physical reality. So often the Timaeus is not appreciated because it just seems like a primitive false physics to us. That's the wrong way to read Plato, and it's the wrong way to read something like the book of Genesis in the Bible. All right? These myths have something to say if you will read them with a little generosity and with a little care. So Plato has Timaeus, who's an astronomer, telling us about the demiurge, telling us about the creation of the world, and he's not going to go too far in trying to give us true opinion about this, or in true knowledge, but he will be able to give us true opinion about it. Now, he starts from the idea of elements. The Greeks work out a theory of the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which are, of course, held over today in the practice of astrology. Right? They're the earth signs and the water signs and the air signs. Well, that's physics from about 30 centuries ago. And Plato and the physics of his time is the beginnings of what we might call the periodic table of the elements. It fractions eventually off into 100-odd elements, but at this point, they only have 4, earth, air, fire, and water. And Plato offers us a geometric theory of the elements, which shows, for example, that he's familiar with people like Empedocles or Democritus, two of the naturalistic descendants of Thales and Anaximander, who were working about the same time as Plato and Socrates. So Plato clearly knows current physical theories, and what these physical theorists have been doing is working out the Greek idea of the atom. Atomic theory comes from the early Greeks, and what this is a theory of material nature, physical reality, that is based upon one substance underlining the wood and the coffee and the carpets and the air and the water. In other words, all these things are undergirded by some sort of material substratum, all the earth and air and fire and water. And what Plato agrees with, and what he's willing to acknowledge as worthwhile in somebody like Democritus, is that these atomic things, these individual smallest bits of matter, have a geometric structure. And the geometric structure, according to Plato, are what are called the Platonic solids, the four regular solids. I think that Earth is a cube. In other words, little particles of Earth are cubic. And I think that the next to the Platonic solids is the icosahedron, and that's next smaller, and I think we get up to Earth, to air and fire and water, all of which are made up of atoms, which are regular solids, and all of these different kinds of atoms that make up the four elements in the Platonic physical cosmos are ultimately made out of triangles. In other words, this is God, but the creator God in Plato is the great mathematician. The universe is made up of triangles. Why? It's the simplest two-dimensional geometric form. And that if you put enough of them together, you can get squares, and from squares you can get cubes. From cubes you can construct all these, and triangles you can construct all these regular solids. So Plato's God, which tells us an awful lot about Plato, is the kind of God that constructs the world out of triangles. In other words, the world is ultimately geometry. Again, go back to what I was saying before about Plato's favorite discipline as being mathematics. Well, if any kind of respectable, intelligent, beneficent God were to create a universe like this one here of tables and chairs, surely he would create it out of the most certain of knowledge, which is geometry. So if we want to know about the physical world, we have to know what was going on in God's mind when he was creating things. Well, since he's really knowledgeable and has permanent, final knowledge the way Plato thinks, well, then he must be a great mathematician. In some ways, William Blake's paintings of God with a compass and a square, exactly this idea. God creates the world out of geometry. God is the great geometrician. And of course, since triangles are the simplest of these forms, that's what the world is going to be. Innumerable triangles that have somehow been made visible objects of sense perception. Not quite as good as Euclidean triangles, but the next best thing. Well, after covering this atomic theory using the Platonic solids, then he starts to offer us teleological explanations. For example, he goes through all of biology and all of chemistry and all of meteorology and all of anatomy, trying to explain why things are the way they are. In other words, a teleological explanation is an answer to the why question, not an answer to the how question. Nowadays, physics exclusively restricts itself to how questions. In other words, it asks, how is it that a solid will fall when you drop it? And they'll talk about 32 feet per second and give you the formula for the motion of bodies that are influenced by gravity. But it never asks, why should books fall? Right? Physics doesn't bother with that sort of question anymore because they found that these ateleological questions, these questions that leave out issues of purpose, why the world should be that way, are nowadays considered the proper domain of physics. But that hadn't been worked out 25 centuries ago. So Plato still has teleology on his mind, and he's primarily interested in justifying God's ways to man. Why would a good God make the world the way it is? So he comes up with explanations which seem kind of facetious but are intended to be gestures towards a kind of physics which will not undermine your understanding of politics or ethics. So, for example, why is it that the human intestine is so long and convoluted? I bet you have been wondering about that. Why would a good God do something like that? Here's the real answer. All right? You may offer some sort of natural selection explanation, which suggests that an arbitrary process of natural selection led to a very long intestine. Wrong. The real answer is that God gave people a big intestine so there would be lots of time between meals for you to digest that, and that way you could study philosophy. In other words, the reason why your intestine is so long is so that you have time to study philosophy. If it was a real short gut the way a hummingbird has, you'd be eating all the time, and you could never read big fat books like this. So you may have wondered why it is that anatomy is organized like that. Hummingbirds never read books like this. Why? They have to spend all their time eating. Why? God doesn't want them to read books like this. And they don't, amazingly enough. In other words, Plato's physics is a series of just so stories. It's like Rudyard Kipling. Why does God want the world like that? Because he wants it to be just so. And amazingly enough, it is just so. So this is supposed to mesh with moral theory. And look, if it gets in the way of moral theory, then it's wrong. What kind of physics is that? That tells us we can't be good. So in other words, all of his physical theory is constantly genuflecting to his ideas of right and wrong and to his political and moral theory. All right? Another question. What are the stars doing up there? In other words, you could have nighttime without the stars. You ever wonder about that? Now, we got a God that's perfectly rational. He's great at geometry. He sits around constructing the world out of triangles. Why did God put the stars up there? You may think that they're just hanging there, out in space, doing what they do. You may be of the modern opinion that they exist for no reason at all. Well, that would be just like you. What kind of a God would construct a world with all those lights in the sky for no reason at all? That's not the kind of God Plato wants. That's a very impious kind of an idea. Plato thinks that the stars and the moon and the planets and all the celestial objects were put up there to teach people mathematics. You see, elsewise it would never have occurred to people to start doing math, right? But when you have this constant reminder every night that there are these things some of them stand still, some of them move, the seasons go round, and day and night alternate, the whole point of all these celestial objects is to help suggest to people that it's time to start studying math. So again, what this is a teleological explanation. Now nowadays, if you look at an astronomy textbook, they will not say in chapter 1, these things are up there so that you can learn math. But you will have to learn math in order to be able to understand these things. All those teleological explanations are out of fashion. No one bothers with them anymore. For our modern physics, we have a divorce between why questions and how questions. For Plato, that divorce didn't exist, right? They were still living together at the time. And for Plato, as a matter of fact, these teleological questions, these questions of why the universe is organized as it is, are the really important questions. The same sort of conceptual schema, this demand for telos, this demand for a purpose, will exist everywhere. Why does God create the universe? Because He's so good. Does He create a perfect universe? No, because physical reality doesn't allow for the perfection of God. He just makes it as perfect as it possibly can be. That explains why physical things come into being and go out of being. The material reality is imperfect. It approximates the divinity and perfection of God, but never really achieves that. Also, you have to remember that Plato is living in what we call a Ptolemaic cosmos. In other words, it's geocentric. We haven't worked out the Copernican revolution where the Earth revolves around the sun. As far as Plato and all the other astronomers of the time are concerned, the Earth stands still and the sun goes around. Right? Why does God do that? He has his reasons. Doubtless it's all for the best. All of his physics is designed to do this. The axis mundi runs through the universe, so the entire universe runs on a course enacted by the demiurge to try and show us that mathematical regularity is the hidden basis of all physical reality. All right. Now, if you're going to be constructing what is, let's face it, only a half-material explanation of the physical universe, which is primarily, in fact, a sort of moral discourse, telling you that, believe me, the earth is just as it should be, and God has a reason for everything, and if you don't understand that, that just shows what an ignorant worm you are. Right? What you should really know is that, believe me, there's a reason for everything. Well, at the end of it, he gives us an edifying discourse. He says, well, incidentally, what happens to souls when they die? Well, as part of his physical theory, he's going to tell you. Why? Well, because, again, we haven't made this clear distinction between theology or mythology and physical theory, a distinction which is insisted upon now, wasn't insisted upon then. And what he finishes with is very much like the myth of in the Republic. It's a reincarnation myth. Obviously, many of these ideas about the reincarnation of souls have been, and the immortality of the soul, have been derived from Orphic and Pythagorean precursors. And I think these Orphic and Pythagorean precursors, which emphasize things like the immortality of the soul and the cyclical nature of the soul and regular judgment and reincarnation and the changes in your incarnation based upon the kind of life you led in the previous life. So if you're good, you get a step up in the line of being, and if you're bad, you move down, and you can even become an animal or a bug or a reptile. This seems clearly derived from India. In other words, I have no doubt that this is Vedic wisdom that's taken 3, 4, 5, 10 centuries to move from India through Mesopotamia and perhaps also through Egypt into the Western Mediterranean. But it seems to me that there's no doubt that that's where the Orphics get it, and that's where Pythagoras gets it. In other words, this is an echo of Indian knowledge that's come through the River Valley civilizations. These cyclical myths, these myths of reincarnation, these myths of judgment and reincarnation based upon your moral status, are clearly not part of the original Doric legacy. The real Doric legacy are, the real Doric myths are hero myths, where tough guys like Hector and Achilles do tough things, but when they're dead, and they stay dead. They don't get judged. They're beyond judgment. They're much better than normal people. I think that the Homeric myths are a real gesture at the authentic Greek legacy. I think that Pythagoras and the Orphics are bringing in something that doesn't come from ultimately the northern part, up north from on the steppes of Eurasia. I think that these cyclical myths of life and death and moral judgment are ultimately all derived from the River Valley civilizations. Here I mean the Indus River, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. So what Plato is a syncretistic attempt to bring together what he understands to be the best of these myths. Socrates is a sort of hero the way Hector or Achilles are heroes, but he's a hero of knowledge and wisdom, not an illiterate hero of death and violence. Also, he's the sort of hero that insists upon moral order in the world and the idea that there will be moral judgment. In other words, there's an inescapable moral judgment which you can't have in the life of a Homeric hero. After you're dead, you're dead. Even if you weren't a perfect guy, even if you had the wrath of Achilles and you had moral flaws, once you're dead, you're dead. You're not coming back as a second-rate Achilles because you didn't live up to your full potential. You're dead, and you're staying dead. All right? So I would say that the myth that we get at the end of the Timaeus is an attempt to justify or to make plausible the idea of universal moral order and universal justice. That's what all these reincarnations and rebirths are about. That's what this flawless moral judgment is about. And that's for Plato, this is an important impetus that he's going to get allegedly from physical theory, from his natural theory, which will drive you towards the good, virtuous, moral life. Remember that for Socrates and for Plato, the new mechanistic physics is a bad thing. It makes people immoral. It undermines traditional conceptions of morality. That's why Socrates is opposed to it, and that's why Plato is offering this new physical theory at the end of his career. All right? This is a very influential myth. It's a strange dialogue, the Timaeus. It's not like any of the other Platonic dialogues. The great Platonist Benjamin Jowett once said, this is a different building in a different style, set off from the others. And it very definitely is. If you read all the dialogues, you find that the Timaeus is very funny. Plato isn't very interested in nature, but here it is anyway. He kicks it out. A second thing is that at the end of this dialogue, we get this little myth. The idea is that the philosopher might, or that the good man might eventually be released from this cycle of birth and death, and this sounds real Hindu to me, and then his soul will go back to the stars from whence it came. So we have kind of a protreptic exhortation towards the good life, masked as a hymn to nature. All right. Now, let's move away from our discussion of the external world. Let's look at the internal world, the world of the examined life. What does a good man that wants to be a knowledgeable and virtuous man do in the process of examining his own life? Well, the first thing you're going to have to figure out is what you are. Are you a knower? Are you a thinker? Are you a piece of meat? Are you a block of wood? If you are a rational soul, then you have to be interested in what you know and how you know it. You have to be willing to examine all your claims to knowledge, and that's what the Theaetetus is about. The Theaetetus is a dialogue that comes towards the end of the middle period, and it's the dialogue leads to an aporia, to an impasse. We don't ultimately find out what knowledge is at the end of the Theaetetus. But Theaetetus is a good interlocutor. He's a smart young guy, and he does make some progress, even though he only finds out the domain of his ignorance. So it's a funny dialogue also because when we get introduced to Socrates and Timaeus, the dialogue is narrated, and it's narrated under the circumstances that Theaetetus has been wounded in battle, and he's also caught dysentery while wounded, and it's obvious that Theaetetus is about to die. And so somebody says, you know, I remember when Theaetetus was a kid, and I wrote down a dialogue he had with Socrates, and Socrates thought very highly of him. Also, it was interesting the way that they're introduced in the beginning of the dialogue, which is narrated by this young man at second hand. What's interesting about it is that Theodorus, the teacher of Theaetetus, is a mathematician. That's very important. In other words, Theaetetus gets a good education because mathematics is the icon of good education, of real knowledge. And for that reason, Theaetetus is open to the next stage, dialectic, the real incorporation of philosophy into his life. So unlike Meno, he's going to have gotten a good education which will enable him to move on, even if he doesn't make any positive gains in the course of this dialogue. Starts in a minor key, though. Theaetetus is at the end of his life, and then we shift back. We do a flashback. This boy narrates the actual dialogue which was written down. And another funny thing, in the course of this, when Socrates gets introduced to Theaetetus by the teacher Theodorus, he says, well, he's a very able young man, very quick to learn, and loves knowledge. It's just that he's kind of ugly, Socrates. He looks like you. No, Socrates is really not an attractive figure, especially in the Greek world, where homosexuality is a big deal and male physical beauty counts for a lot. Socrates is a freak. Socrates is the least handsome. He's got a snub nose and he's short and he's not attractive at all, but he's got a great soul. And again, the distinction between soul and body is everything for Plato and Socrates. And when Theaetetus is introduced as having a great soul, a knowing soul, well then, Socrates doesn't care what he looks like. He likes souls, not bodies. So when Theaetetus and Socrates both look similar, it indicates in a kind of dramatic sense that they have similar souls too, both as searchers after wisdom. Now the first time that they meet, Socrates asks Theaetetus, well, what is knowledge, Theaetetus? I mean, you know, you've been studying math and this other stuff. Could you tell me what it is? Because I need your help. This is Socrates feigning ignorance, his usual move. And he starts asking the questions. What is knowledge? Theaetetus stops for a second and says, you know, I really don't know, which is a good sign. Anytime one of Socrates' students says, I don't know, the student goes up in Socrates' estimation. So students that know how to keep their mouths shut, that don't have too high an opinion of themselves, are the ones that are most educable, that are actually the best students. Right? You'll find that consistently through the dialogues. Well, Theaetetus at first says, I don't know. And then he says, well, my best shot is that knowledge is sense perception. And Socrates says, well, that's an interesting try, son. And then they discuss that briefly. And one of the important things that emerges is that this idea that knowledge is sense perception has in fact been proposed before, primarily by the sophists. All right? Particularly Protagoras, who holds the view that all knowledge is relative, that what is for you, and what is for me, and that man is the measure of all things. In other words, a sort of absolute relativism. And that fits right in with this idea that Theaetetus has been offering to us, that knowledge is sense perception. Now Socrates makes explicit here in that first part of the dialogue where they discuss the first answer to the question, makes explicit that Heraclitus, the great Ionian thinker, or the great Ephesian thinker, who emphasized the fact that the world is plurality, that the world is constant flux and change, that's an ontological doctrine which is presupposed by Protagoras. In other words, the idea that everything is relative, that all knowledge is relative, depends for its intellectual foundation on Heraclitus, the idea that everything is constantly changing, everything is in flux. So what we're showing here is that Socrates thinks that sophistry comes from an ontological doctrine spawned by this new physics. So physics and sophistry are explicitly linked in the beginning of this dialogue. And he says, look, the reason you think that all knowledge is relative and that man is the measure of all things is because you have this constantly chaotic changing universe, and naturally one relativity is going to be derived from this constant flux, this constant change. There's going to be as many different universes as there are people observing it. Now Socrates then goes on to show that if the world is constantly changing the way Heraclitus says, then there's no one thing for us to fix our thought on. Heraclitus is known for the statement, you can't put your foot in the same river twice. Well, that's true. If you put your foot in the river and you take it out, put your foot back in the river has changed. Its whole shape and structure have changed. All the pattern of the water has changed. It's not where it used to be. You can't put your foot in the same river twice. Well, Socrates is going to take that a little further and say, look, if Heraclitus is right, you can't even put your foot in the same river once, because everything is constantly changing. In other words, all our nouns are illusory. There's just a set of processes in the world, and they're not really distinguishable. You can't separate the river from the air, from the clouds, from the trees. Everything's constantly changing. So that means that this universal flux leads to universal incoherence. So the world is a constantly changing phantasmagoria, a booming, buzzing confusion. Of course, if you were to take that proposition seriously, you could only draw the conclusion that human knowledge, which is somehow isomorphic to this world around us, is going to be equally confused and equally relative. And if I say that the grass is green and you say that it's red, well, and you see it one way, I see it another. Protagoras, in other words, is the elaboration and the articulation of Heraclitus' views. What this leads to in the case of Protagoras, who's the kind of author of the idea that knowledge is sense perception, or one of the authors of that idea, is that if Protagoras is right, then this destroys knowledge and language altogether. In other words, if everything is completely relative, if you go for this absolute relativity of both knowledge and speech, it means that we end up with what's called solipsism in philosophy. It's the belief that only I am real. So if I say that this is a winged chariot, well then it is for me, but for you it might well be a podium. If we're all right, and if there's just absolute relativism, then it's a winged chariot, and if someone else wants to tell me that it's a Jeep, then it's a Jeep, and if someone else wants to tell me that it's the Washington Monument, then it's that. that leads to the breakdown of knowledge and the breakdown of language altogether. So what Socrates proves in the first part of this argument is that if Protagoras is right, then knowledge and speech are impossible. Blah, 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 that's all we ever get if you think about it long enough. So that can't be the right answer. And Heraclitus can't be the right ontological answer. And the idea that all knowledge is sense perception is intrinsically self-contradictory and incoherent. That's no good. Now, Theaetetus gives two more answers to the question of what is knowledge after this first one is refuted. But before we get to that, we have about a 10-page section which Plato explicitly calls a digression. And this digression is a long praise of the contemplative as opposed to the active life. And it's obvious to me, I thought about this problem all summer. What is that digression doing there? Plato's too good an author to ever digress. He's so disciplined, he doesn't put anything in by accident, and there's no stupid malformation in Plato. Everything's there for a reason. And it also seems very clear to me that this digression makes sense if you put it into the end of the dialogue. In other words, we're going to give three answers and questions and answers about the nature of knowledge. At the end of it, we don't get anywhere, but then Socrates goes on his long encomium of the contemplative life, of the examined life. Well, it seems to me that what Plato did was, after writing that, saying, you know, that digression there really is a digression, because it doesn't have anything to do with my earlier questions. I know what I'm going to do. And I can't prove this, it's just the way I think the dialogue was written. I think what he did was take his conclusion and shift it over to the center of the dialogue, and then ironically call his conclusion a digression. In other words, what I'd like to suggest is that exactly the opposite is true. This digression is in fact the marrow. It's the center of the dialogue. And all this logical discussion about the nature of knowledge is in fact a sort of frame for that. The nature of knowledge discussion it leads to an aporia. It doesn't get anywhere. It leads to an impasse. But the whole point is that even though our discussion of the nature of knowledge leads to an impasse and doesn't get anywhere, we have shown that it's the practical life that's the real digression. The contemplative life is in fact a moving towards the center. It's a convergence on what human life really ought to be, on the telos of the soul. So my argument then is that this digression in the middle is exactly the opposite of a digression. In fact, it's the core. It's the painting. And this logical stuff on the outside that all the books of commentary get written about is the frame to the picture. It's not the picture itself. So this is a very unusual interpretation. So, I mean, you will have to read this on your own and see if you can't find someone better that understands it better than I. But my reading of it is the exact opposite from what it says in the book. I think that Plato is being ironic, and most commentators don't hold this view. Right? But in any case, whether we want to accept that reading or not, it's clear enough that the logical discussion of the nature of knowledge doesn't take us very far. After we get past the digression, Theaetetus offers two more possible answers to the question, what is knowledge? Answer number two is that knowledge is a true judgment. But Socrates examines that. They engage in the dialectic. And what's nice about Theaetetus is that he understands immediately how the dialectic is supposed to be conducted. Unlike Meno, he doesn't give an enumeration. He tries to give an enumeration first, but Socrates says, no, look, give me an every and only definition. That's the kind of Socratic essential definition I want. And Theaetetus immediately picks up on that and says, okay, now once I've gotten into the swing of it, unlike Meno, I'm willing to exert myself. I'll give you an attempted every and only definition. And even if it's wrong, I'm at least willing to exert myself to engage in the dialectic. So what he says for his second answer is, okay, I've tried this for an every only essence of knowledge. It's true propositions that we can account for. So he says that this is true judgments. Now the problem with true judgments is that it's possible to make true judgments even without having knowledge. And he gives this example. Socrates refutes him with this. He says, look, think about a legal case. If you're on the jury and a good lawyer comes in and gets some witnesses and says, look, I have witnesses here to show you that Mr. X did Y, well, you as a juror can come up with the right answer, can generate true opinion or true judgment based upon what you hear from the witness, not having been there. In other words, only the witness really knows what went on. But as a juror, you can be convinced about that if you are given this information secondhand. Now, we don't want the foundation or the essence of our knowledge to be the possibility of mere secondhand opinion. So Socrates is going to say the problem with the idea of True judgment, his second answer, as being real knowledge, is the fact that it seems to overlap true opinion. And opinion and knowledge are fundamentally different things. We want that certainty that real Platonic, capital P, knowledge is going to offer us. So the second attempt doesn't work very well. The third attempt, and perhaps the most sophisticated attempt that Theaetetus offers, is that knowledge is a true judgment with a logos, or with an account. Now, the Greek word logos is funny because it has a number of meanings that overlap and that are distinguished in English. Logos means speech, but it also means reason, and it also means argument. So when a Greek talks about the logos, in this case, a true account with a logos, he means true account with a reason or an argument behind it. And many of the great philosophers that have read this, because it's a very, very rich dialogue. I mean, almost everyone that has philosophical interests gets a lot out of the epistemological discussions in this dialogue. This was very highly thought of by Ludwig Wittgenstein and Lord Russell, because they saw it, I believe, as a sort of precursor to logical atomism. Russell talks a great deal about warranted assertability, having some warrant for making an assertion. Well, Theaetetus' last idea, that that knowledge is true judgment plus a logos, plus an account, anticipates that in many ways. I believe in not the Tractatus, but the Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein has a number of passages about the Theaetetus, and that tipped me off. My reading of Wittgenstein sent me back to that, and it tipped me off to a lot of interesting kind of isomorphisms or coherences, connections between this last attempt by Theaetetus and what modern empirical philosophy does, or modern logical atomism in particular. Now, it turns out that there's a problem here too. Socrates points out that the idea of true account, of true belief or true account with a logos, true justified belief with an explanation or a reason, turns out to be circular and leads to some sort of infinite regress. In other words, if you're going to know that we have here a true statement or a true judgment, and I'm going to have here a logos which justifies that, which gives us a warrant for making that assertion, the difficulty is that we have to know that this is a logos. Now the difficulty is, how will you know a logos when you see it if what you're trying to figure out is what is knowledge? Right? So he says, look, you're presupposing what you're trying to prove here. Don't get cute. I mean, I admire you, son, because you're using your head and you perhaps will get the idea someday. But this is circular. And all attempts to say that knowledge is true justified belief, justified on the basis of some argument, you have to know that this counts as an argument for it, which presupposes what you're trying to prove. In other words, it turns out that knowledge is one of those architectonic things that is over and above, supervening all the distinctions that we might readily want to make about the nature of knowledge and the connection between an assertion and the warrant for it. How do you know that's a warrant? And then how do you know that you know? And then how do you know that you know? You're going to get an infinite regress out of that. This is the kind of thing that Socrates comes up with all the time, and you want to just brush him away. I mean, it's clear why people were going to decide to kill him later on. I mean, A, he's ironical at time. B, you constantly think that you're going to get the big answer, and then, no, I'm sorry, he's thought that out before you have, and it's wrong. Right? So Theaetetus is first of all, morally improved in this dialogue. He's shown, first, the limits of his ignorance. He has moved from his study of mathematics to his study of dialectic, the method by which we study problems like what is justice, what is knowledge, what is wisdom. If you look in the Republic, when Socrates talks about the education in the ideal state, he says first they're going to be firmly grounded in mathematics and gymnastics, or the muses and gymnastics, but mathematics will be a big part of the training of the guardians. But after a certain point, when they finish their mathematical studies, they'll gradually be introduced to dialectic. And I think what Socrates is doing here is showing how and in what way we will move students of mathematics into the upper reaches of knowledge. In other words, we'll move them from the second point on the divided line to the highest point on the divided line. And this is not a body of dogma that we are giving them. In other words, you don't get thrown the Socratic answers to the Socratic questions. All you do is get thrown the Socratic questions, and then you're on your own. You're supposed to faithfully follow this sincere and intelligent attempt to make some sense out of the world. But the point is not the destination. The point is the journey. The point is the actual striving after knowledge. You enlarge the domain of your consciousness. And by enlarging this domain of your consciousness, the ironic part about it is that in the process you enlarge the domain of your ignorance. You understand how much there is to know and how little you know of it. There's a sort of humbling result that you get from any well-conducted Platonic dialogue. And here we have an example, unlike the Meno and the Euthydemus, where a young man, a promising young man, who works very hard, doesn't get anywhere. But in the process of working real hard is morally improved. And remember that this is a mimesis. In other words, this is a representation. Plato represents a good man morally improving other men, offering Greece a new kind of hero. And in other words, Socrates is a figure of the good man doing good things, a new sort of hero for Greek culture, and a sort of hero to be, a subordinate hero, like Theaetetus, who is just about to lose his life at the beginning of the dialogue. All right, it shows how we will create the heroic next generation, heroes of the spirit as well as heroes of action, because Theaetetus is killed in battle. Now, as an ironic finish to this, as there is to so many of the Platonic dialogues, at the end of their discussion, Socrates says, well, now I have to go. I can't continue to discuss the nature of knowledge with you. I have to go to the chief archon's office to answer some charges that have been preferred against me by Meletus and Anytus. In other words, Socrates is cut off in mid-discussion. He says, look, I'd like to talk to you tomorrow. Why don't we meet? But Socrates won't be able to meet because Socrates is going to be accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and accused of impiety, and he's about to die as well. So the beginning and the end of this dialogue starts with the death of Theaetetus, ends by foreshadowing the death of Socrates, and Socrates is cut off by the people of Athens just as he's in the midst of his inquiry into the nature of knowledge.